Thank you very much, Dr. Xu. So today we're going to look at the question, how do we know when a creative idea is worth developing and implementing in the process of innovation? You've probably all heard of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Goals. These sustainable goals are international examples of reasons we want to find creative ideas for innovation. In this lecture, we will explore two questions related to ideas that may or may not be developed for innovation, regardless of what our goals may be. Question number one, how is idea generation different to idea evaluation? And question number two, why is it important to evaluate in context rather than in isolation? So before I start my lecture, if you could just talk to the person sitting next to you or the person sitting behind you and ask them these two questions, and on the evaluation sheets that you've all got, and if you haven't, there are some extra copies being passed around, just jot down bullet points of what you think the answer to those two questions is. So I'll just give you 2 minutes to jot down a couple of ideas. So speak to the person next to you or the person sitting behind you and jot down a couple of ideas on the evaluation sheet, which I will collect at the end of the lecture. Would anybody like to volunteer an answer to question number one? How is idea generation different to idea evaluation? Any ideas? Okay, so just jot down a couple of bullet points if you do have some ideas that you don't want to share at the moment. The process of innovation usually begins with generation of ideas in response to a business problem, an identified gap in existing products or services, or a desired outcome to meet seen or unforeseen needs. The United Nations came up with the 17 sustainable goals, in response to problems that exist in the world, such as poverty, inequality, and pollution. Organizations that wish to provide solutions to these major world problems start by generating creative ideas. These creative ideas are then evaluated, and some of them are selected for further development. To avoid wasting resources, only the ideas that are likely to be valuable in bringing a healthy return on investment for those who are funding the innovation are put forward into the next stage of development. We all have the capacity to generate lots of ideas, but it's evaluating these ideas that requires a distinct level of skill. It seems that many modern innovative companies, such as Google and Apple, pride themselves on creating work environments which are conducive to idea generation. For example, they are proud that they are creating environments where there is trust between team members, where the employees have freedom to take risks, there's time and space to play and have fun, they're able to reflect on random ideas, they provide flexible working hours, and there's a low level of stress. Now, this kind of environment is appropriate for the first stage of innovation, which is generation of ideas. Trust, freedom, risk-taking, they may be conditions that are ideal for generation of ideas, but not necessarily ideal for evaluation of ideas. We need to use very different thinking styles when we are generating ideas and when we are evaluating ideas. For example, divergent thinking. Sometimes divergent thinking is called out-of-the-box thinking. Sometimes it's called blue skies thinking. So divergent thinking and acceptance of random ideas without criticism is associated with idea generation. For example, brainstorming activities. In contrast, convergent thinking and critical thinking to consider whether the idea is in alignment with organizational values, whether it's a strategic fit, whether it will achieve the desired outcome, is more appropriate at the evaluation stage. In the idea generation stage, we need to encourage risk-taking, and we need to discourage criticism. In the idea evaluation stage, we need to discourage risk, and we need to encourage critical thinking so that we don't waste money and time on ideas that have, maybe they've been hyped up without consideration of their drawbacks. In the idea generation stage, we are more interested in being open, whereas in the idea evaluation stage, we aim to be selective instead. So when we think about the question, how is idea generation different to idea evaluation, we need to remember that we are using very different thinking styles and approaches. In an organization, an employee who is talented in generating ideas is not necessarily the person who is the most skilled in evaluating ideas. Can anybody think of any other ways in which idea generation is very different to idea evaluation? Apart from these things that I've written in the table here, can anybody think of any other ideas? In one of those types of thinking, we have an abundance. Which of those stages do you think we're talking about an abundance? Is it at the idea generation stage, or is it at the idea evaluation stage? Generation. We have an abundance of ideas. We have thousands of ideas every day. So in idea generation, we're thinking about abundance. In contrast, in idea evaluation, there is not an abundance of resources. So we're thinking about scarcity. We're thinking about limitation. We're thinking about what do we have? What is feasible for us? So we have to think within parameters, whereas with idea generation, there are no parameters. It's an open field, okay? So let's go back then to this slide. So we talk about environments that companies like Google and Apple create for their employees to generate ideas. So rather than trust is important when we're generating ideas, but instead of trust, when we're selecting ideas, we need tolerance. We need tolerance of diversity. Whereas in idea generation, we're encouraging freedom. In selection, it's not freedom. We have to think about accountability. Because the manager who signs off the budgets has to be accountable. They have to be accountable for the investment that they put forward into that idea. So it's not freedom that's most important, it's accountability. In idea generation, we're thinking about time and space to play and have fun, but in the evaluation stage, we need time and space not to play and have fun, we need time and space to contemplate, to reflect on the idea, which is hard work. In the idea generation stage, we're thinking about reflecting on random ideas. In the evaluation stage, it's not random ideas. We have to think about specific ideas. We have to think about specific ideas which are relevant to our organization. In idea generation, a company may provide flexible working hours, but in idea evaluation, it's not flexibility that's most important. What's most important is meeting deadlines. The manager is accountable. They need to have, we can't work on this idea for years. We need to have an idea which is going to be ready in a month's time or in 2 months' time. So we're more concerned about meeting deadlines rather than flexibility. In the idea generation stage, we're thinking about, we need to be relaxed and have a low level of stress. In the idea evaluation stage, no, we will inevitably create a high level of stress because people need to work to very tight deadlines and they need to evaluate a lot of different variables, so we are expecting a high level of stress. So now, please jot down in the little bullet points and on those evaluation sheets, what do you think is the difference between idea generation and idea evaluation? You should all have at least 4 or 5 ideas now of how the two are different. I'm just going to give you a minute to add to the bullet points that you had already. In comparison to the idea generation stage, there is less academic research that focuses specifically on the evaluation of ideas. Nevertheless, there are dozens of methods and tools used to facilitate the process of evaluation and the selection of creative ideas. Braddock, 2018, you have the reference for this at the end of the slides that Eric Xu will put onto your canvas, is it? Yeah, it's already there, okay? So there are 7 consecutive phases that need to be gone through in order to implement the idea. We start off with identifying and organizing the ideas, then we make a list of available methods and techniques. We build a set of criteria, usually, to select a particular method or tool. Then we select the tool or method for evaluating. We implement the method, select the idea, and then we implement the idea. The important thing to remember in this process, this analysis of the process that we need to go through from idea generation to idea evaluation, is that when we choose the method that we're going to use to evaluate the idea, that implies an evaluation itself. You know, how do we know which method will be the best method to use? How do we choose the method? How do we evaluate the method for evaluating the idea? So, okay, let's go. One of the methods that is very commonly used for evaluating is criteria. You know, when we mark your assignments, how do we evaluate your assignments? Well, we have a list of criteria, and we match what you've written based on the criteria for that module. When we're thinking about innovative ideas or creative ideas, we might choose an idea because there is novelty in the idea. It might be feasible for our organization. There might be a good return on investment. The idea is legal, it's ethical, it's a popular idea, it's a good strategic fit, it's timely. However, when we go back to the United Nations Sustainable Goals, an idea may be novel in one country, but it may be unpopular in another country. It may be feasible in one location, but a poor return on investment in another location. It may be a good strategic fit this year, but next year it may be a very poor strategic fit. So can you see that when we use a list of criteria for evaluating, there are limitations? So this is using a list of criteria to evaluate, it has limitations, and many of the other evaluation tools that you can check out for yourself using the Braddock reference, they are based on this kind of linear thinking in terms of the criteria and the mechanistic view. And what I'm going to talk about in today's lecture is an alternative to that. An alternative is the systems thinking view. Has anybody here heard of systems thinking? Have you heard of systems thinking before? Okay. What do you know about systems thinking?
So first, we don't have this page in our presentation at all. So we'll make this page.
Okay.
Systematic thinking means that you think in this logical way. You combine and summarize the information and in systematic consequence. So you will have a conclusion based on the arrangement of the systematic consequences of different information.
Okay, all right. So as we progress, we might find that there is, it can be misleading. There are many different interpretations of systems thinking. So this list, you're right, it's not there in the slide. I added this later. Okay, I added this slide, but I will let Eric have this slide as well. So I just wanted to summarize what systems thinking is. And as we go through the lecture, I will outline each of these different points. So basically, instead of looking in isolation, systems thinking encourages us to evaluate ideas in context. It's a way of seeing life as complex. It's interwoven relationships. So we're not looking at things in isolation, we're looking at things as being interconnected physically, emotionally, socially, and ecologically. And this way of thinking is often associated with the phrase associated with ancient Greek philosophers. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The well-known management consultant Peter Senge, he uses the concept to remind us that if we divide an elephant in half, we don't get two small elephants. Midgley says a random heap of organs. So if you take out my heart, my liver, my stomach, and we separate all of those organs, that doesn't form a human being. Okay? And, it's a way of telling us that there are invisible forces that are no longer present when we take things apart in a process of analysis. So the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So this is a contrast. Systems thinking is a contrast to the Newtonian way of thinking. The Newtonian way of thinking is a very mechanistic, cause and effect, linear relationship. But this is not about linear relationships. This is about complexity and interconnectedness rather than, so it's more than the logical. More than the logical. It includes the irrational. Okay. So complexity theory is part of systems thinking. So it's about complexity. And complexity theory suggests that small changes can lead to huge impact. Unless we use our imagination to envisage the potential impact of a creative idea, not only in present time, but also on future generations and life that is distant to us in space and time, it is difficult to foresee the consequences generated by a seemingly insignificant idea. So things like the coronavirus, this is best explained through complexity theory. We can't identify one single cause somewhere. It's a complex set of variables that have created chaos all around the world. So something like this cannot easily be explained by linear thinking. We need to think about complexity. We need to think about chaos theory to explain this. And another example of complexity theory is, for example, serendipity. Does anybody know what serendipity means? Serendipity? Serendipity is when it's like a coincidence or an accident that occurs when a set of variables coincide to create an outcome which we were not actually looking for. For example, penicillin. Sir Alexander Fleming, he didn't set out to discover penicillin. He came back from a 2-week holiday and found that his Petri dishes were covered in a fungi, which he was not expecting. And he noticed that this fungal, residue that was growing in his Petri dishes, it killed off the bacteria that was on those Petri dishes. So through serendipity, he discovered penicillin, and it transformed our lives. It transformed medicine. So that is, those kinds of serendipitous events are more explained by complexity theory rather than linear thinking. So when we go back to the United Nations Sustainable Goals, if somebody is thinking about how to resolve climate change, for example, it's something like somebody discovers a very simple, small idea for how to make use of plastic, how to transform seawater into drinkable water. And there are people who have created those kinds of innovations or who are creating things like that through upcycling rather than recycling plastic, etc. But with complexity theory, with systems thinking, the impact is usually unpredictable. And that's why we need lots and lots and lots of ideas. We need to generate an abundance of ideas, and at the same time, we need to be selective with wisdom. So synthesis is very important in systems thinking. Synthesis is about putting things together, whereas analysis is about taking things apart. Many evaluation methods analyze or decompose the creative idea being evaluated. In contrast, systems thinking seeks to evaluate a creative idea through synthesis. And so when we put things together, we sometimes find that there is a synergy. Something occurs, something has taken place which was not there in the parts. And this something extra is called emergence. So through emergence of creative ideas, we can look into the spaces between the ideas, whereas when we decompose the ideas, the analysis often ignores the spaces in between. So synthesis, systems thinking relies on patterns and relationships. Creativity is more likely to be found in dynamic relationships rather than inanimate objects. And Capra and Luisi, two advocates of systems thinking, they advise that it's more appropriate to map these relationships to identify patterns and configurations rather than attempting to measure and weigh them. When we evaluate ideas in isolation, measuring their likely return on investment or weighing their value against previously identified criteria, rather than in relationship to other ideas, we may overlook or ignore the value generated in the patterns created through the relationships between ideas. Very often, when teachers are evaluated, for their teaching, the relationships are overlooked, and very often the high-quality teaching occurs through the relationships, through the patterns of interaction between the teacher and the student. We can't weigh this. It's not something that can be weighed. It's not tangible enough to weigh it. We need to evaluate it by looking at the patterns and by looking at the relationships. So, whereas, on the other hand, if we are evaluating an idea out of context, without looking at the patterns, we fail to notice the incremental changes that happen around those patterns. I mentioned emergence earlier on. So emergence is lost when we are evaluating in isolation. Emergence is described as the novel properties that arise when a higher level of complexity is reached by putting together components of lower complexity. These new properties are not present in the parts. They emerge as a result of the relationships and interaction between the parts. For example, animated films. Now, you know how animated films are formed, right? How do we form animated films? Like Scooby-Doo or, Mickey Mouse, any of these animations. How do we form that motion? So one movement, like one clip of maybe 30 seconds will probably be how many pictures? Maybe thousands, maybe hundreds, for a 30-second clip, okay? So animation, we draw the individual, pictures, and then we put them together, very fast speed, and it looks as though there is movement. That's emergence. Emergence is when something new is created by putting parts together, and we create something which was not there. We create something from nothing. Emergence, another way to describe emergence is like if you are hopping on one leg, you might hop on the left leg, you might hop on the right leg, and we put those two motions together at fast speed and we walk. So walking is not the same as hopping on your left foot and your right foot. Can you see that? Hopping on one foot, hopping on the other foot, it's not the same as a walk. 2 hops doesn't equal 1 step. The step, is an emergent property, in the same way that with the animations, it's an emergent phenomenon. So systems thinking encourages us to look for emergence, and we can only look for emergence when we're not being very narrow with our parameters. Another reason why it's important to evaluate in context rather than in isolation is that there are no feedback loops when we evaluate in isolation. So, for example, we might reject an idea. Very often we reject an idea and, we just totally discard it. And we might discard those ideas because they don't fit the selected criteria, they're low on the level of priority, or they may have been tried and tested already, but failed. They were unsuccessful previously. The feedback for these rejected ideas is usually cursory, and it could be that, well, if the idea is rejected because it doesn't fit the priorities, well, maybe it might fit a different set of priorities. If those ideas have failed previously, why did they fail? Maybe they failed for reasons which are no longer existent at the moment, so they might be good ideas now. So just because they failed in the past doesn't necessarily mean that they are bad ideas now. So we need to take the context into consideration, including time and space. And authors such as Senge, Kraft and Bosch, they remind us that cause and effect create simplistic, linear relationships, whereas conceptual knowledge, for example, creative ideas, in some cases, that simple cause and effect is the right way to think. In some cases, we need to be thinking on a linear level, but not with ideas, because ideas are conceptual. And because ideas are conceptual, we need to use circular rather than linear thinking. When we evaluate ideas in isolation, we're not thinking about the circular causal relationships. For example, an idea may be perfect in one context, but inappropriate in another context. Most important is that the idea is constantly changing. Because it's a concept changes all the time. And so, because it's always changing, it might be appropriate, like this moment here, it's not appropriate, but tomorrow it might be the perfect idea. So it's only through circular relationships and creating those feedback loops that we can take into account whether the idea is really worth investing in or not. Another reason why we need to think in context is in terms of stakeholders. In business, ideas are often evaluated in reference to a relatively small number of stakeholders. Many organizations, they only think about their customers and their investors, and maybe their competitors. But it's a very narrow range of stakeholders that they're taking into consideration. But there's a very broad range of stakeholders, and the broader we can be in terms of taking into consideration the stakeholders, the more ethical, the more sustainable our decisions might be. So here I've made a list of very common stakeholders. Can anybody think of any other stakeholders that I haven't listed here? For example, think about the person who was selling, meat in the market, and it was wild meat, and it had a virus. That person who was selling that meat, which stakeholders do you think he was not thinking about? That person was probably thinking about their customers, right? They were thinking about their customers, and they were probably thinking about their family as stakeholders. They need to feed the family, and they were thinking about their competitors, other people. Who do you think they were not thinking about? Who do you think most organizations don't think about when they are thinking about investing? And I haven't put it on there. They might think about their own community, but who do they not think about? The government, have I not put government? Yeah, the government is an obvious one, yes, but more broader than the government. You're all impacted here, You're all, so many of you are wearing masks. You are very far removed from where the coronavirus started. So who are we? The global. So we're part of the global society, aren't we? Most organizations wouldn't be thinking about the global society. And who else would they not be thinking about? Have I not got on here as a stakeholder? Most organizations think about the here and now. Who are they not thinking about? They're thinking about who can they sell to, who can they make money from now, and who do they not think about?
Potential customers?
So they're thinking about potential customers now. So think about climate change and things like that. The lobbyists, that's all very hot news at the moment. Who do they think about? The lobbyists who are thinking about climate change at the moment, who are they thinking about? Are they thinking about the here and now? How far ahead do you think when you think about, getting involved in business, when you are working in a business, how far ahead do you think? What, 10 years, 20 years? Some people think about their children, some people think about their grandchildren. They're also stakeholders. Like your grandchildren are stakeholders. But most organizations will not be thinking that far ahead. I know that in Japan, some companies in Japan have 100-year plans. They don't just plan for 20 years, they plan for 100 years. They plan for 100 years. So if you're planning that far ahead, 100 years ahead, your stakeholders would be your future generations as well. So that would be another important stakeholder is future generations. When we take a more inclusive approach and we take into consideration the impact of innovations such as fast food, we may be able to avoid what Ritchie describes as the high price of cheap food. He discusses food and agriculture that puts products on the shelves of supermarkets at blinding speed, but poisons land and water and damages the health and happiness of farmers and food workers. He argues that factory farm agriculture externalizes significant environmental, social, and political costs. In doing so, businesses based around agriculture push the costs of air and water pollution, disease resulting from toxic exposure, and social dislocation onto individuals, the public sector, and future generations. So we have fast food now. Maybe there's a lot of profit to be made from fast food, but 50% of children, in some communities, 50% of children are obese. They're obese, so because they are obese, that puts a strain on the National Health Service, it puts a strain on the communities, so that has an impact on future generations. So rarely do businesses take into consideration the impact of an idea on future generations, whereas a systems thinking approach enables us to take into account stakeholders that are not physically present here and now. They're not physically present in our local space. Taking into consideration the context in which an idea is generated, we take into account organizational structures. For example, is the organization a network or is it a hierarchy? Because ideas will be evaluated differently based on whether it's a network or whether it's a hierarchy. Companies such as Apple, do you know what kind of organizational structure Apple has? Is it a hierarchy or is it a network? Yeah. Same as Google. Apple, Google, the very modern companies like this, they pride themselves on being networks rather than hierarchies. Steve Jobs, he took great pride in encouraging creative collaboration and organizing his members of staff into working in circles rather than in hierarchies. Networks are associated with ecological organization. For example, the natural dynamics of plants, microorganisms, they revolve in systemic networks rather than structural hierarchies. Now, one of the criticisms of hierarchies when it comes to evaluation of ideas is that we may feel inclined to favor ideas that come from higher up in the hierarchy compared with our subordinates. So you're in a team meeting and your boss puts forward an idea and a subordinate, someone who is junior to yourself, challenges that idea. Which idea do you think is going to get put forward? The idea put forward by the boss or the idea put forward by the subordinate? Very often it's the power. The person in the position of power, their idea will be valued more because everyone thinks, well, if they are the boss, then their idea must be more valuable than the person who's a cleaner, for example. Because the cleaner, you don't expect them to have as much skills. They might have a much better idea, but people will think, that's probably not as good. So in a systems thinking network, we take this into consideration because we have to think about, well, whose ideas are heard? Is it necessarily the person with the most power? Are their ideas going to be the best ideas? Now, Brehm and Wolfram argue that the creative and clever ideas of slum dwellers contribute to the development of many small enterprises in India. For example, these slum dwellers, they probably know more about recycling than somebody who is very rich and who has never had to recycle ever in their life. But because they are slum dwellers, they're unlikely to be at the board meeting when people are making decisions about how to recycle, how to create sustainable enterprises. They are not likely to be invited to a board meeting in a hierarchical structure, whereas in a network, their ideas are more likely to be heard, because with a network, people are willing to reach out and work at the grassroots level. Can anybody think of any other examples where we might not take into consideration an idea simply because we don't have the language for it? Can you think of any other examples? Well, one example, which is quite a famous example, is that, in some cultures, like in Iceland, there are some cultures in Iceland where it snows a lot. It snows for most of the year. They have about 12, 15, 20 different words for snow. Now, I only know one word for snow. So because I only know one word for snow, I wouldn't be able to recognize the different types of snow. I wouldn't notice that there are 20 different types of snow, whereas somebody who lives in that culture, they're familiar with different kinds of snow. They can label, they can say, this is, that kind of snow and this is that kind of snow. Can anybody think of any other examples like that, where because we don't have the language, we don't have the experience, we don't recognize things? Another example of where power is very, very, we have to take into consideration that it's not always the person with the most power who has the best idea. This is a true story. There was a top consultant. This is in America. It was a top consultant who was, he had to take out somebody's kidney. One of the kidneys was not working, and he had to operate to take out their kidney. And the nurse, when she saw him getting ready to do that operation, the nurse tried to warn him and said that he was marking the wrong side of the body. And he didn't listen to her. He just, because she was a subordinate, he didn't listen to her. He just told her to shut up, basically, and just pass him the scissors. He took out the wrong kidney. And he left the kidney that wasn't working. And that's a true story. So that's an example of somebody in power thinking that somebody who's a subordinate, their idea is totally dismissed. That's also to do with our the way we think, the way our cognition is, that we tend to kind of think that because we are superior to somebody in our status, because of our expertise, because of our experience, we dismiss them. So this kind of goes into the issue about language, that language is very, very important in terms of our perception. Now, Senge, this quote is from Senge. Senge says that language shapes perception. What we see depends on what we are prepared to see. Western languages, with their subject-verb-object structure, are biased toward a linear view. Languages that constrict us to follow a linear structure, where a sentence only makes sense if it follows rigid rules, may distort our perception unless, as advocated by the systems thinking approach, we take into consideration a broader worldview where a diverse range of languages may indeed present an enriched contextual understanding and awareness. Now, there are important implications of the influence of language and distorted perceptions. For example, Braddock says that safeguarding measures installed to protect ideas that have been presented using inaccurate or ineffective language, perhaps because the person presenting the idea is using a third or second language for communicating with their audience, that idea may not come across as being as valuable as somebody who's presenting it in their first language. So let's say you're in a board meeting and there are some people who speak English because it's their native language, and there are other people for whom English is their third language or their fourth language even. And maybe the person who is speaking, who's putting forward an idea, it's not in their first language, their idea might be better, but the person who's speaking using their first language, they might present a poorer idea, but it seemed to be better just because the person who's evaluating can recognize the language used to express it. So we need to be very careful that we're not being biased because our perception is distorted through language. So to minimize this adverse impact, when evaluators fail to grasp the essence of the creative idea because of the language barriers, systems thinking encourages us to create feedback loops so that ideas may be presented in a variety of languages, including not only the first language of the evaluators, but also the first language or the dialect of those who have generated the ideas. So sometimes when we have a very powerful idea, if I have a very powerful idea, I would like to present it in English rather than in Italian, which is a third language. It's a language that I speak very, very badly. So if I presented that very same idea in a language which is not my first language, that idea would not be evaluated as a powerful idea. Another reason that we need to take a holistic view of the world seems to lie in the mystery of apparently void spaces and patterns that reveal themselves when we shift our perspective or we connect the dots in a complex array of disparate events. For example, when we see the reverse side of an embroidered picture, it can look very messy with long threads that dive in and out without forming a coherent pattern. It's only when we turn the embroidery the right side out that we see the different coloured threads forming aesthetically pleasing pictures. Is there anybody here today who's wearing a knitted jumper, for example? Is there anybody who's wearing a knitted jumper? Well, if you are wearing a knitted jumper, you know when the jumper is inside out, it doesn't look very beautiful when it's inside out. We have to turn it the right way up to see the aesthetic beauty of it. It's the same with the ideas. We need to look at ideas from the right angle. If I'm reading a book, if I read a book in English, and I'm reading from, if I read a book in English, I have to read from left to right. If I'm reading it from right to left, it's not going to make very much sense. But if I'm reading a book in Arabic, and I read from left to right, that's not going to make very much sense. So I have to think about the context. In Arabic, I have to read from right to left for it to make sense. In some languages, you have to read from top down rather than left to right. So we have to think about the context and think, well, are we evaluating the idea based on the right perspective? Is it the right way up? Before we evaluate it as a poor idea. Going back to the rejected ideas. So maybe those rejected ideas were not presented at the right angle. Maybe it was not a strategic fit for us. So if we look at the metaphor of a work-related process, imagine that you've gone for a job interview and they've rejected you from the job interview, maybe because you didn't fit the criteria. And we can ask, well, who made the decision? Was it an individual or a group? What tools and techniques did they use? Why did they choose those tools and techniques? All of these issues will have an impact on how that decision was made. In systems thinking, we have to think about feedback loops. The best way to think about feedback loops is when we use the metaphor of the weather. So when we're looking at the weather, you know that it rains, but it doesn't rain forever. It rains and then the clouds disperse, and then there's sunshine, and then the water evaporates and it forms clouds again. That's all part of a feedback loop. Same with a thermostat. In every room, like when the temperature reaches a certain point, the thermostat turns off, and then it gets colder again, and the thermostat goes back on. It's the same with ideas. When we are presenting our ideas, if we present our ideas in a very cold environment, emotionally cold, no one is receptive, we're unlikely to express our full potential, whereas if we receive a very warm reception, we're likely to produce more ideas. Now, in system thinking, temporality is an important point because every idea is always composing, decomposing, reshaping itself. It's a concept. So we need to think about time as an important factor in evaluating the ideas. Very important point in evaluating ideas is subjectivity. Now, as judges for an idea, usually it's very linear. You know, when we're marking your assignments, the teacher judges your assignments. It's a linear evaluation. You don't very often have the opportunity to evaluate the person who's evaluating you. But with systems thinking, there's that feedback loop. The evaluator, the judge, is also judged. You know, the evaluator gets evaluated. So it's not just always subjective, it's objective as well. So there's an interplay between subjectivity and objectivity. When we evaluate, our perceptions are based on our identity, our values, our beliefs, our position, our status, our range of experience, our level of expertise, and our state of mind. And very importantly, our unconscious. Very, very often we don't acknowledge the impact that our unconscious has on when we are evaluating these ideas. For example, our unconscious in terms of familiarity. If we hear an idea that is familiar to us, we're more likely to think that that's a good idea because it relates to what we already know. But if you put forward an idea that I don't have a frame of reference for, your idea might be very powerful, but because I don't recognize it, I think that's a very poor idea. That's a very random idea, and I evaluate it very, very poorly. Can anybody think of any other reasons why our unconscious is important in terms of evaluating ideas, apart from familiarity? Well, familiarity is one thing. The confirmation bias is another thing. So the confirmation bias, if I'm expecting you, because I think you're a brilliant student, I already have that bias in my mind. I think you're a brilliant student. You put forward an idea. I'm more likely to think that idea is a valuable one because I'm expecting it. You're confirming what I already believe. Whereas somebody else, I think that they're a very poor student. They never do their work, they never do their homework, so I'm expecting very poor results from you. You put forward an idea, and through my confirmation bias, I will think poorly of that idea simply because that was my predisposition to it. There are lots of other confirmation biases and conscious biases such as that, but I know that Eric needs to speak with you soon. So what I will ask you to do now is, I gave you an evaluation sheet with 2 questions to answer. I have gone through 12 different reasons why we need to evaluate ideas through context. These are some of the things that I said. Maybe you have other ideas apart from these why it's important to evaluate in context rather than in isolation. So if you could just jot down a few more points on those evaluation sheets. You don't have to copy all of these things. What do you, for you, in terms of the most important of these reasons for evaluating context, what do you think are the most important reasons? Just jot down a few ideas and then let me have those evaluation sheets at the front when you have finished doing that, please. Any questions? Does anybody have any questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, and please let me have 2 sheets. Thank you.